Holy God, may the words of my mouth and the meditations upon all of our hearts be worthy in your sight and in keeping with the teachings of your Son, Jesus Christ, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. My grandfather on my mother's side died when I was young, around 9 or 10 years old. But I still retain some good memories from him. For example, he would always take my younger brother and I out for pancakes, known as hotcakes, at McDonald's, knowing full well that my mother would never let us have those for breakfast. It was a successful ploy in that my brother and I always loved going out to breakfast with our grandpa. He got to spend time with us, and we got sugared up. My grandfather also had a very specific phrase that I don't really hear anymore. Whenever somebody did something he didn't agree with, he would say, "Far be it from me." Coincidentally, this is a phrase from Abraham, the Jewish patriarch of the Bible. The phrase, for those of you who aren't familiar with it, is basically a soft guilt trip. Far be it from me to tell you what to do, but if I were you, it's basically a respectful way of saying, reconsider what you are about to do. Funny enough, this is largely how the Gospels depict Pontius Pilate, the Roman governor of Judea in Jesus' time. Pilate has a very hands-off approach in the Gospels when it comes to Jesus' trial. He tries multiple times to pawn off the punishment for Jesus onto other people, including the Sanhedrin and Herod, but neither ever give in to him. Ultimately, the pressure is too much, and Pilate agrees to have Jesus executed, albeit reluctantly. But actually, there is a lot of debate around Pilate in biblical scholarship. We don't know a lot about Pilate from history. But what we do know, it seems like the gospel writers let Pilate off really, really easily. You see, despite the fact that Romans wrote everything down, Israel was such a backwater country that even the meticulous Rome didn't have much interest in recording anything about it. That's how insignificant Israel was to them. But we do have records that Pilate was a really, really bad guy. Probably the worst person I'm going to talk about in this sermon series based on body count alone. For example, Pilate did not die in office, but was removed by Roman authorities for being too violent. Pilate ordered an attack on a group of Samaritans that were gathered trying to dig up artifacts apparently left by Moses. And while Pilate claims that the people were armed, the Roman government, who I remind you did not care about Israel, certainly didn't think so. This was just one of the many times that Pilate used violence to maintain control in Israel. According to the Roman historian Josephus, Pilate offended the Jews by using the temple treasury to pay for a new aqueduct for Jerusalem. When a mob formed while Pilate was visiting Jerusalem, Pilate ordered his troops to beat them with clubs, and many died from the blows or being trampled by the guards' horses, and the mob was dispersed. In the gospel, Jesus even mentions Pilate mixing the blood of Galileans with their sacrifices. It's been suggested by historians that this incident isn't mentioned in history books because it was so common for Pilate to do this that it wasn't worth including. With all these cases in mind, it seems strange that Pilate would be hesitant to execute Jesus. The reason that historians have speculated about Pilate's hesitancy over executing Jesus was not him actually caring about whether Jesus was innocent or not, but because he didn't want to risk political upheaval with so many upset Jews in Jerusalem for the high holiday of Passover, and having a giant riot on his hands. What's so curious to me is that the Gospels never talk about Pilate's actions as good or bad. Pilate is the one who orders Jesus' death, yet most of the blame in the story falls on the Jewish leaders and Judas. But he still orders Jesus' death. Much like Caiaphas, Pilate ultimately allows one of the greatest evils ever for the sake of maintaining the status quo. While Pilate was no disciple of Jesus, this is a choice that we face, and it runs counter to Jesus' message. How many times a day, a week, do we buy clothes or goods that are made in sweatshops, or food picked by low-wage laborers, and say, "Far be it from me," trying, like Pilate, to wash our hands of it instead of making a change in our own lives? It's easy to blame the system, blame the people who set the system up, and begrudgingly allow evil to happen because it's easier to say that something is horrible and do nothing about it than to do something. I think it's a fair comparison to say that we live in a modern-day Rome, filled with the same relative prosperity that Rome had in Jesus' day. We have the same influence the Romans had over its vassal states. But instead of slaves and colonies, we have day laborers and corporations. We have power, and therefore we have the responsibility to use that power to further God's kingdom, not the world's kingdom. This may seem like an impossible ask. After all, we are just individuals. We can't change the will of corporate overlords and shareholders to start to care about the poor. And in a way, if you thought that, you would be right. But that doesn't excuse us to try. But there's also another hope. Jesus says in his gospel, or on the Sermon on the Mount, "Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they shall be satisfied." Jesus assures us that there will be a day where our need for righteousness won't feel like an impossible dream. That there will be a day where the meek will inherit the earth. And we can either be the ones that fight for it, and as Jesus says, be persecuted for righteousness' sake, or we can be like Pilate, and we can try to wash the blood from our hands. By no means do I mean that this would be easy. I don't know a single person in the United States that could be considered guiltless of this. Even just striving for justice is an uphill battle most of the time. Some days, fighting for such a thing will just be a hopeful sigh. And others, it will be the choice between what is easy and what is right. What Jesus promises us is that every step of that hill will be worth the fight in the end. Amen.